When the Arab Spring protests swept through the Middle East 7 years ago, demonstrators across the region were hoping for democratic reforms and even the overthrow of local despots. But is war-torn Libya really a better place now without its brutal dictator, Colonel Gaddafi? And how did Bahrain become the forgotten revolution? An UpFront special. Libya remains a mess. The country continues to grapple with civil war, humanitarian crises, foreign interventions, and the threat from ISIL. This week, a panel of UN experts said a political solution in Libya remains out of reach in the near future. So, looking back, was the NATO intervention in 2011 to topple Colonel Gaddafi in the midst of the Arab Spring a mistake? Will continued foreign intervention from outside powers bring more harm than good? And who's to blame for the violence and chaos on the ground that's produced such a massive refugee crisis? Joining me to debate this are Hafed Al-Ghwell, columnist at Arab News and former senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., and Mustafa Abu Shagur, former Deputy Prime Minister of post-Gaddafi Libya. Thank you both for joining me in the arena. Mustafa, given how many problems Libya has right now, political, economic, social, security, do you have any regrets about supporting that original NATO-led intervention in your country in 2011 to topple Gaddafi?
I think we are very expectations are much higher than they should be, because when you have people, they lived under 42 years of oppression. You don't expect those people to be able to make it directly and to become a democratic society in a few months. And that's what has happened. So what is going on today is really we are paying for the legacy of the regime.
So no regrets about 2011?
No, I do not. Because really, if the intervention had happened, Libyans could have been killed thousands and thousands on the hands of Gaddafi.
Hafed, you were an opponent of Gaddafi for a long time. Where do you stand on the intervention? Was it a mistake to get rid of Gaddafi in the way that he was got rid of and everything we've seen since?
I think it is a huge mistake, and I think both Libyans and the world is paying for it consistently. I disagree with Mustafa on several issues. One is that talking about, and I was one of the opposition, talking about his intolerance of any opposition was quite long time ago in terms of history. It was in the late 70s and the 80s. We also, and the world all, can attest to this, that Gaddafi's policies have changed dramatically over the last 10 years.
So just to be clear, for the sake of our viewers, you're saying that Gaddafi, who was a brutal dictator, brutalized his people for several decades, Libya would be better off if he was still in power today?
Without a question, because because it was a civil war between two sides of Libya in 2011. There were and still are significant tribal presence that is in support of Gaddafi and still loyal to him. The fact that NATO and Europe intervened on behalf of one side against another does not make it a revolution.
Mustafa, it wasn't a revolution because it was a civil war and outside powers.
No, it was a revolution, definitely, because those people who they went to the streets in Benghazi at the beginning, and then in Tripoli and other cities there, really they're coming out really against the oppression that they have lived under, and the tyranny they have lived under for many, many years. I think the intervention by the United Nations through NATO is really to save the Libyan lives. And the intervention really happened because of that.
When Hafed said that Libya would be better off today under Gaddafi, as someone who was in the post-Gaddafi government, what's your response to him?
No, it's not. I mean, clearly, from one aspect, you can say it is better off, because people, they were living under oppression. Yeah, maybe there is some security, but security that serves Gaddafi himself, not the Libyan people. But now, really, we have taken several steps towards making the place better. But again, yes, I mean, security is not great in Libya now. It is improving slowly, but it's not ideal in that sense. But also at the same time, Libyans have taken some steps that will not go back under that. They were able to do some real elections that have taken place.
You say not great, not ideal. Some might say you're kind of underplaying how bad the situation is on the ground.
No,
you have dozens of different militia groups in different cities competing for power. You have ISIL turning up for a while, running one of your cities.
But this is the making of Gaddafi himself. He is the one who took these criminals out of prison, 17,000 of them. He is the one who distributed weapons to everybody because he wanted to make sure.
So let Hafed respond to that then. This is the legacy of Gaddafi. It's easy to blame the outsiders.
No. It's what Gaddafi did 7 years ago, we're coming up on 8, cannot be blamed for infinity. Not infinity, but Mustafa said 4 decades he was in power for. Yes. It's only been 7 years. In the grand scheme of history, it's not that long a time to recover. I'm not defending Gaddafi, but the same argument that they used to blame Gaddafi can be used today to blame what happened in the last 7 years.
So let's put that to Mustafa. How have things improved for ordinary Libyans? Because Hafed is disputing.
No, I mean, it is clearly people are far more free to express their opinions today.
I am not. I'm still threatened while I am in the United States. If I go to Libya, I'll disappear within 24 hours.
During 30 years of Gaddafi regime, if I stepped inside the country, I would have been hanged in the streets. So that's not the issue.
I did not go to Libya for 31 years, Mustafa. So I know that. But to answer your question completely, I am against Gaddafi. But once you have a government that is reforming and moving in the right direction, it doesn't take a brain surgeon. It's not Gaddafi who did it. It was the system around him that was improving and moving to the right direction. So 7 years would have been enough to see some results. But what we did we spent the last 7 years...
Let Mustafa come in. I asked you earlier, Mustafa, what are the results? He keeps challenging you, saying everything's worse now. You were Deputy Prime Minister in a post-war government. You supported the intervention in the war.
I did.
Tell your fellow Libyan what's better in Libya today. What are the results?
What is better in Libya today is that, first of all, Libyan people, they start enjoying some of their freedoms. Yes, it is the conditions that we have today. It is a legacy. When Gaddafi was toppled, there was no institutions in the country to be able to carry on.
Mustafa, you were kidnapped by a militia. You yourself were kidnapped by a militia.
That's true.
They disagreed with your policy. How much security and freedom of speech does that reflect?
No, that's true. I mean, I have been kidnapped, but that's irrelevant to this case here.
He's kidnapped by a militia and he still thinks it's a better off place. That's at least his devotion to the cause.
No, it is, because really, I have been against Gaddafi for 30-some years, okay? And the changes that Gaddafi did at the end, they were not genuine, because really they were targeted to lay the ground for his children to rule the government for the next 50 years. The only army there, it's militias of his children. There is no real Libyan army that he left for us.
The irony is that if Saif runs today for election,
Saif Gaddafi.
If he runs today for election, all probability is he will win.
You have no evidence for that. What's your evidence for that claim?
But if you monitor, for example, the social media,
a lot of people in Libya watching this show might say it's easy for you to say that, saying in the US. For us, it was a horrible life living under a dictator. It's better Gaddafi's gone.
Let me ask every Libyan: are they today better off security, economically, politically, even if
that's what we're trying to debate today. Is that the legacy of Gaddafi, or is that the fault of the people who came after Gaddafi?
I think it is the fault of the people who led this uprising. A lot of them were from the Gaddafi regime themselves. Mahmoud Jibril, Mustafa Abdel Jalil, among other, Ali Al-Isawi. All of these guys, they are the ones who did not put Libya in the right direction. I think
you made it, but let Mustafa come in.
First of all, those people, why they are doing that? Because these institutions, they were oppressing them for so long. And when the Arab Revolution started, clearly they find, maybe they can do that.
Let me move the conversation on. Let me ask you this. Outside powers have played a big role in Libya. Both the original Western-led intervention, NATO, the United States, Britain, France, but also today, Qatar, Egypt, the UAE, taking sides, different militias, funding and arming different groups. What's the solution to that?
What it is that the intervention from those countries really is the one which is causing these problems what's going on. I mean, you see it.
So when you were Deputy Prime Minister, what did you tell those countries?
No, at that time it was very different. I was there in the first year.
So you never took support from any outside countries?
No, not really.
None?
Never did. And that time it was I'd say the much better time, because really there was some progress has been taking place. Unfortunately, I think what happens later on, when the country becoming stable, those countries clearly they have different agendas for it, because first of all they want to end anything called the Arab revolutions, because those regimes in these countries, they are dictators and they are afraid of a country which can be democratic, can be prosperous, and also wealthy, which is Libya. So they have done everything to support.
Or they might be afraid that look what happens when a dictator falls, it turns into a mess. We don't want that in our countries. But you're not exactly a great ad for the Arab Spring, Libya.
Or they are the ones who they have contributed to this mess, and they're still funding it today. I mean, if you look at...
Surely you would concede that point, Hafed. If Libya were left to the Libyans, to your fellow Libyan people, it would be in a much better place. Again, you're giving a pass to other people who've caused problems.
Two things. One is, yes, these countries have never interfered with the Libyan government directly, but the problem is they've always interfered with militias that...
So all I'm asking is, if they didn't interfere, wouldn't Libya be in a better place?
I want to make my second point. You cannot blame other countries. I mean, this is the problem with all the supporters of this. They blame Gaddafi. They blame foreigners. They blame Qatar and the UAE and others. They blame the failure of the UN. You cannot build a state or a country on that basis. You have to take responsibility and realize that the failure, the fundamental failure is Libya.
Okay, hold on, but that's good rhetoric, but you yourself are admitting that outside countries are supporting different militias. The President of the United States, former Barack Obama, has admitted on the record, one of my greatest mistakes, if not the biggest mistake, was not planning for the aftermath in Libya. Precisely. Had the US planned better, had outside powers stayed out, wouldn't Libya be in a better place today?
It's not their job, sorry.
Well, they're the ones who've caused the war.
No, they came a month
and now
later.
They're propelling the violence.
No, from their point of view, they're supporting their own interest and supporting. That happened everywhere, in Lebanon, in Iraq, everywhere. The naivety of saying for a political leadership that we are blaming everybody else instead of taking our own initiatives to build a state is nonsensical.
Mustafa, if you are blaming outside powers, doesn't that mean basically Libya will be messed up for a long time to come? Because those outside powers aren't going anywhere.
No, I mean, partially,
so what are you going to do about it?
No, I mean, partially I'm blaming the outside world, but clearly we as Libyans we should be responsible for this. And this is the problem that we have. When people live under dictatorship for 40 years, they have no room for dialogue. There is no room for any other opinion. This is what you have. You have people who they have this culture, the culture of oppression, and they find themselves in a position now, they are not willing to talk to one another.
But when it's interesting you mentioned culture. A lot of people in the West have this view of Arabs can't do democracy or you need to have a strongman culture. And in a country like Libya, it doesn't help that there's this guy, Khalifa Haftar, former general, who's now running a bunch of militias, who was accused of being a former CIA asset, accused of being an Emirati asset, accused of war crimes. He seems to have a lot of power and influence in a section of the country. Is that where Libya is heading back towards? The arms of another dictator, another general, another colonel?
I think Libyans, they would never accept another dictator. They would never accept another military rule. Of course, Mr. Khalifa Haftar that you mentioned, he was supported by Egyptians and the Emiratis, by money and weapons, because they want to make sure that this revolution will never get out of there.
So what do you do about someone like him who has that much power?
Clearly has to be contained. Right now there is the United Nations going for an election for the end of this year. And you have said...
You mentioned the United Nations. This week, a panel of UN experts said, and I quote, a political solution in Libya remains out of reach in the near future. Do you disagree with them?
I read it, and I partially agree with them. Yes, that will be very difficult for us to be able to get out of this mess, because we Libyans have to realize that this opportunity, it is a lifetime opportunity for the country to be able to take it forward. And I think we are responsible for getting together and being able to reconcile, be able to build the country. And of course, we expect from the international community to stop.
For a population to remain silent for 42 years does not mean that they don't take a blame. The focus has to be for any statesman to move the country forward. The idea that...
Are you an optimist about the future?
No, I am not, because even the election nonsense. Libya had a number of elections. It produced nothing but division. You and I know that sometimes elections in these kind of mess and these kind of societies that don't have any institutions create civil wars.
Last word to Mustafa. Are you an optimist?
Yes, I am. I look at what's going on is a natural progression that unfortunately we go through. I was in Libya. I'm in Libya 3 weeks ago. I was there. And I was driving throughout the whole city of Tripoli. As a matter of fact, there is a lot of improvement security-wise.
If I can, that's when I go there to visit, then I'll let you know that it is secure.
Okay. Why don't you both arrange a joint visit? We'll have to leave it there.
I'll be glad to.
We're out of time. Thank you both for joining me on Upfront. It's been 7 years since the Arab Spring protests broke out in the Gulf monarchy of Bahrain, with thousands of demonstrators at the Pearl Roundabout in the capital, Manama, initially calling for reforms and eventually demanding the ruling royal family step down. Human rights groups say the Bahraini government continues to violently crack down on dissent and lock up political prisoners. So what's the future for the country's protesters? Joining me to discuss this is Maryam Al-Khawaja, a Bahraini activist in exile and advisor to the Gulf Center for Human Rights, who's been sentenced to prison in absentia by the Bahraini authorities and whose father is currently serving a life sentence there and has been called a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International. Maryam, thanks for coming on Upfront. You called the February 2011 uprising in Bahrain an inconvenient revolution for the Arab world and for the international community. What did you mean by that?
Well, what I meant is that because of Bahrain's geopolitical importance being, between Saudi Arabia and Iran and hosting the Fifth Fleet and now also a base for the United Kingdom, there are a lot of interests that are based in Bahrain, wherein, when we took to the streets in 2011, we knew that we weren't just up against the Bahraini government, but rather the 6 GCC countries plus their allies, the United Kingdom and the United States. And I think to the most part, we've been proven correct in that. The United Kingdom and the United States continue to sell arms to the Bahraini government, and they continue to some extent to prop up the monarchy in Bahrain as well.
So the deck is stacked against you. When you were on this show 2 years ago in 2016, you said you wouldn't call the Bahraini Arab Spring protests a, quote, failed uprising. You said change would happen, and it would happen either through a very violent situation coming about because of the repression or international pressure forcing the government to, quote, do the right thing. Neither of those things have happened in the intervening period. Do you now accept, whether you like it or not, it has been a failure, the uprising?
No, I don't, because if you look at Wednesday, the 14th of February, was the 7th year anniversary of the Bahrain uprising. And the amount of protests that happened around the country, I think, is even more evidence that the people of Bahrain will continue to protest until they reach their demands for civil and political rights. That being said, because of the nature of the situation in the region, but also internationally, of course, it's going to take time. When I said that there's going to be a path of violence or a path of reform, that's still a path we're on. Bahrain is best described as a pressure cooker, because things will turn more violent if we continue down this path, but there is still an opportunity for reforms. It's just about whether that international pressure happens or not.
Just to be clear for the sake of our viewers, you've been accused by the Bahraini government, you and your family, of being violent people, supporters of terrorists, etc. All sorts of accusations thrown against you, charges thrown against you. What is your position on violence?
I believe in nonviolence as a methodology for change, political and social change. Let me put it this way. Even when I was being assaulted by 4 police officers in the airport in Bahrain during my arrest, I did not lift a finger to defend myself. So even when I'm being attacked, I believe that nonviolence is a way of regaining control of the situation and not being reactive.
And you mentioned a demand for civil and political rights going on right now on the anniversary of the revolution of the protests this week. Just to be clear again, what are the goals of the protesters in Bahrain? Is it just political reform, more freedom, more rights, or is it a revolution against the monarchy, a regime change?
Well, as you stated in the beginning, when people took to the streets, it was about the king fulfilling the promises that he made in 2001, which was a constitutional monarchy. Nothing that has happened since then has led us to a path of constitutional monarchy. On the contrary, he unilaterally changed the constitution, placed himself above the constitution, and gave us a parliament that has no legislative or monitoring powers. And so when people took to the streets, they were just demanding that he fulfill his promises. It was after they started shooting and killing unarmed protesters that the demand shifted from being just about the constitution to demanding the stepping down of the ruling family.
The Bahrainis say, the authorities say, we offered reforms in 2011, we offered reforms again in 2014, the opposition boycotted any kind of elections or participation in the political process. It's the opposition who walked away from dialogue, from reform, from working together.
I mean, all you have to do is look at the facts on the ground to know that there's absolutely no truth in that. First of all, Al-Wafaq and Wa'ad have been disbanded, the largest 2 opposition societies in the country. We have a parliamentary election coming up later this year with no opposition to run in the elections. But even let's talk about the elections themselves. The gerrymandering in Bahrain puts even Texas to shame, wherein the opposition can receive up to 60% of the vote, but only 18 out of 40 seats in parliament.
And those are all fair points. Just on 2014, was it, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, was it a mistake for the opposition to have boycotted elections?
So I'm not a politician myself, but I do understand that, you know, when Al-Wafaq and when Wa'ad and so on came out and said that they were not going to participate in the elections, to me it makes sense, because if they had participated, they would have lost complete credibility amongst the communities that they're supposed to serve. They would have lost complete credibility amongst the people of Bahrain. But even taking it beyond that, for them to take part in an election that was a sham, that would have only served to, you know, give the government the legitimacy it was seeking internationally.
You mentioned that the Bahraini people who have been protesting against the government, demonstrating against the government, are not just up against a ruling royal family, but up against the United States government, which supports that ruling government. Has the election of Donald Trump as president of the US given you cause for optimism or pessimism? Has it made things better or worse for the people of Bahrain?
The situation has definitely gotten worse. I mean, when we're looking at in 2017 in May, 48 hours after President Trump met with the King of Bahrain and said there will no longer be a strain on US-Bahrain relations, 5 people were killed, extrajudicially killed, and up to 300 people were arrested on the same day. That's more than we had even in 2011. But on the other hand, the Gulf monarchies love President Trump, and so he has a lot more sway with them than Obama did, which means that he can also influence the situation in ways that the Obama administration could not.
But what evidence is there that he wants to influence the situation in a way that you would support?
That is exactly the question. There is an understanding that there needs to be reform in Bahrain, that the situation has continued to deteriorate, whether we're looking at the number of political prisoners, whether we're looking at the use of torture by the military now, as well as the Ministry of Interior, and so on. So there is that understanding. The question is, how do you build policy behind that understanding?
Many people who look at the Middle East today, look at the region, they see proxy wars being fought everywhere. And the argument is that a lot of what goes on in the Middle East is basically Saudi Arabia versus Iran, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Bahrain. And a lot of people think, and the Bahraini government claims, that the protests in Bahrain are driven by Iran. It's all about Iranian sponsorship, Iranian involvement, Iranian provocation. You have a Shia majority country with a minority Sunni ruling family, and Iran is basically stirring up the hornet's nest there. What do you say to them?
Well, I think, you know, all you have to do is look at Bahraini history to understand that. The Bahraini ruling family has been trying to paintbrush the opposition as anything that is perceived as a threat du jour. So, for example, you know, to begin with, we were all Nasser socialists, then we all became communists, then we all became Iranian agents, and now we're terrorist Iranian agents, and now apparently also Qatari agents as well. But I think Iran getting involved in Bahrain is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more heavy-handed the crackdown is, the more Iran speaks out saying that there's oppression and torture in Bahrain, and the more there's a failure from the West to do so, the more the Bahraini people are going to, you know, find themselves in a position where they don't see any other way out or any other ally than Iran. Is it the best thing for Bahrain? Of course it's not.
Well, the Bahraini government say it's a cause of violence. They point to November of last year when one of their main oil pipelines, they say there was an explosion caused by, quote, terrorist sabotage linked to Iran.
Well, of course,
the Iranians deny it, obviously.
The Bahraini government has been making a lot of claims for a very long time, way beyond, you know, 2011. They've been talking about many terrorist cells. Now, the question is, why is it that the Bahraini government refuses to allow any form of independent investigation to back up their claims? That's where I place the question mark. I'm not saying it's not happening at all. I don't know if it is, because I don't have access to that information.
How much of this is sectarian? You've said on the record in the past, you've called Bahrain a semi-apartheid regime because of its discrimination against Shias there. You've attacked the Bahraini military and compared some of its rhetoric to ISIL's rhetoric. The Bahraini government says that's absurd. We're one of the most secular liberal governments in the region.
When you're looking at the situation in Bahrain from a sectarian viewpoint, the sectarian language that's being used, the discourse is coming from the government. Basically, sectarianism is a tool that's being used to divide and conquer. That's the whole purpose of it. Have they been successful in actually creating sectarian violence in the country? No, they have not, because the Bahraini people generally from, its origin have always been a very peaceful, very friendly society, the Sunnis and Shias alike.
You're not just a human rights activist. You're someone who's actually personally deeply affected by all of this. Your father is currently serving a life sentence in Bahrain after a trial that a lot of human rights groups criticised as unfair, unjust. He's been on hunger strikes. You and your sister both had to leave Bahrain after being detained and charged with crimes there. And you've basically been campaigning on the issue of Bahrain and for your family and for others, I think since, the age of 22?
Earlier even, yes.
How hard is it to keep carrying on like this when the odds are clearly so stacked against you?
Well, I think, change is going to come. It's just a matter of time. Given the economic shift that's happening, the climate change and the way that it's going to affect the Middle East, and all of these changes that we're witnessing right now, plus, the changes happening in Saudi Arabia at the current time, I think it's becoming more and more evident that it's just a matter of time before things change. It's just about how that change is going to come about. And I really hope that it's not going to be by everything exploding into violence where we can no longer...
Getting worse before it gets better.
Exactly.
Maryam Al-Khawaja, thanks for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you.
That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.